Hey, good afternoon. I'm here at the church office. I've been making some calls today. Hopefully, we'll get in touch with all of you guys soon. If you know of any needs that you have or anyone in the congregation has, please give me a call on my cell phone or at the church office. Church office is 592-3091, and let us know if there's anything that we can do to help you guys in this second week of being sheltered, self-quarantined in our homes. We've been sitting around, we've been reading online, we've been watching the news, and a lot of us are starting to get anxious or maybe lose hope that life is going to resume anytime soon in a way that we're comfortable or familiar with. And so, what I'd like to do for just the next 4 or 5 minutes is just give a really brief devotional about hope. I think a lot of times we look at hope as something that somebody just has or they don't. Like you could be physically strong or you could be physically weak. And in the same way, you could just be full of hope or you could be anxious and fearful. But history is actually filled with some really interesting examples of people that became more hopeful over time. And of course, the Bible has a lot to say about how we can grow more hopeful as people as well. I thought of a really interesting historical example, and it comes from the life of one of my favorite historical figures, and that is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was actually born a very sickly child. He grew up just being schooled in the home because they were afraid to send him out. He had asthma. He was very sickly. And interestingly enough, somehow historians came across the results of a student physical that Theodore Roosevelt had been given when he was a senior at Harvard University. And the end results of that physical examination were that the doctor told him that because of his weakened heart, because of his weakened lungs, he must live quietly for the rest of his life, choose a sedentary occupation where he just sits around at a desk, and he refrained from anything vigorous, even so much as running upstairs. Well, the reason that's kind of funny is because if you know anything about the life of Theodore Roosevelt, he was one of the most active and vigorously living historical figures that we've ever had. He climbed most of our country's mountains, helping turn those into national parks. He was the second best boxer in his class at Harvard. He faced combat in the Spanish American War, and he was even a cattle rancher when he wasn't actively working in politics. There's even a famous story about this time in North Dakota on his cattle ranch when the rivers had just broken free of their ice, and somebody stole his boat. And the story goes that he and a couple of his hired hands instantly went to work building a second boat. They then threw it into the river, and for 3 days through icy waters, they gave chase to those original boat thieves, even camping out right along the river as the ice flowed by in the freezing North Dakota spring. In other words, this was a guy who was told that being outdoors and hunting and climbing mountains and being a rancher were things that he would never ever achieve because of his health difficulties. But of course, that suffering led to hope. He wanted to live outdoors, he wanted to be a hunter, he wanted to be an outdoorsman. His suffering led to hope. He then pursued those things and lived one of the most wild and exciting lives of anybody in our country's history. A lot of times people tell you that if you suffer, it just pushes you away towards the things that you hope the most for. But I love that example because it tells us about the life of somebody whose suffering and absence of something created a hope, which he then pursued and experienced in fullness. A great Bible passage that talks about how we can grow in hope comes from Romans 5, verses 2 to 5, and I'd like to read that to you at this time. It says, "We boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit." This passage is making two really interesting claims. It's saying that we can grow in our hope in two ways. The first way is it tells us that as we suffer and as we look to God and as we trust in God, that produces perseverance. As we become people who don't quit easy, as we become people who persevere in our trust of God, we become people of greater character, and our character creates a greater capacity in us to have increased hope. Uh, Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. In other words, as we trust God in the hard times, as we trust God even in the midst of our sufferings, it builds our character and we become people with an even greater capacity to have hope that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. The other thing it says at the end of that passage right there in Romans 5, verse 5, is that the Holy Spirit actually increases our hope. God comes into our hearts, God comes into our lives, and he gives us just a greater capacity to hope and pursue the things that we hope for as well. These are crazy times. I'm sure that in the last 24 hours alone, you've had anxiety or fear over your business or the health of loved ones or what your future is going to look like. What I want to encourage you guys with right now is that Romans 5, 1 to 5 tells us as God's people that he works through everything, even our suffering, to give us a greater desire and a greater character to move towards the things which God has promised for our lives, and our ability to have hope and exercise hope and move towards hope increases as a result. I encourage you guys to spend a little bit of time today reading Romans 5, 1 to 5, and as you do, you will be encouraged that God works through all things, even suffering and even the unknown, to give us a greater capacity to be hopeful people. God wants you to be a more hopeful person, and God is going to give you the strength and the experiences that allow that to happen. Think about that, pray about that, and we'll come together with more verses for hope soon.